In something reminiscent of a suspense movie, a shooting in 1970 on a nearly inaccessible iceberg in the Arctic Ocean left a Navy research division desperately seeking answers. How do authorities deal with an alleged murder in one of the most remote places on the planet? The shocking murder on Fletcher's Ice Island deserves to be remembered. On its website, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution describes a surprising project of the Soviet Union in 1937. A scientific team was landed on an ice floe near the North Pole. A team of just 4 men drifted on the ice island for more than 2,600 kilometers over the course of 264 days. The institution explains that the crew regularly measured ocean depth, took bottom soil samples, measured water temperature, took water samples from different levels, and carried out meteorological observations. When the station drifted into the Greenland Sea, the men had to be evacuated, which included a degree of difficulty, but the scientific expedition made important discoveries, including that there was neither large land masses nor small islands in the vicinity of the North Pole, and that the opinion about lifelessness at the near pole region was disproved. The weather and magnetic observations were particularly valuable as they opened the possibility for routine air routes across the Arctic. The Soviet program using such drifting stations continued from 1937 to 1991 and included 88 polar crews. Woods Hole writes that the research program of the North Pole drifting stations is unequaled in the 20th century by duration, variety of observational material, importance of scientific discoveries, and number of resolved problems. Surprisingly, though, the institution notes that the Soviet post-war activities in the Arctic were unknown to the West until 1954. But the United States was also interested in research in the Arctic region for numerous reasons. Woods Hole explains that the U.S. began using B-29 aircraft to conduct reconnaissance observations in 1946. By 1951, the Air Force had identified several large ice islands floating near the North Pole and decided to establish a weather station on one of them to do geophysical research. Rear Admiral Carl Holmquist wrote in the Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute in 1972 that the Air Force, with large air bases at Thule, Greenland, and Fairbanks, Alaska, had a vital interest in the Arctic environment. Scientific information was needed for such problems as search and rescue, survival, and the construction of emergency landing strips in the Arctic. The ice island on which the Air Force chose to establish a station was called T3. The science magazine EOS noted in 2019, the ice island stretched more than 77 square kilometers, an area larger than Manhattan, and its level surface made it ideal for landing aircraft. Holmquist writes that T3 appears to have broken off from Yelverton Bay on Ellesmere Island, probably sometime after 1935. The ice island, about 130 feet thick and covering a 5 by 10 mile area, consists of freshwater ice interspersed with layers of dirt and gravel, all formed over the last 3,000 years. On March 19, 1952, a team led by Colonel Joseph Fletcher, the deputy commander of the U.S. Air Force's 4th Weather Group, landed on T3 in a C-47 aircraft equipped with skis. Fletcher told Scientific American in 1954, "When we reached it, the pilots made 3 touchdown attempts before they were finally able to land our plane on the rough ice. As we slowly opened the door to leave the plane, a biting wind hit us in the face." While still designated T3, the island became commonly known as Fletcher's Ice Island. T3 turned out to be quite persistent. While many other temporary stations had to be abandoned, T3 carried on. It was occupied by the Air Force between 1952 and 1954, then occupied again in 1955, becoming what Holmquist calls the nucleus for an Arctic research program during the International Geophysical Year in 1957-58. At the same time, Holmquist writes that the U.S. Navy Office of Naval Research was conducting its own drifting ice station program, as it was convinced that it was essential for much-needed Arctic research. There was no other way to gather data on the Arctic Ocean environment except with great difficulty and expense. In 1960, T3 became grounded, and parts of the ice island broke off in a storm. The Air Force decided to abandon the T3 station in 1961. But the island broke free by the end of 1961, and in 1962 the ONR identified the island floating more than 100 miles north of its last location, and realized that most of the station was still intact, and they decided to occupy it again. The Air Force officially transferred the equipment to the Navy. The Anchorage Daily News wrote in 2023, "Transferred from the Air Force to the Navy, the mission remained the same, to learn more about the mysterious Arctic. At its peak, more than 40 scientists and engineers were stationed at Fletcher's ice island, engaged in a diverse range of biological, geophysical, and meteorological studies. Some of the data collected there is still used today, functionally irreplaceable given the myriad difficulties of research so far north. While the operation was conducted under the auspices of the Navy's Office of Naval Research, the station was usually occupied entirely by civilians. Geophysicist Carolyn Ruppel told EOS, "The men spent months and months on this island under extreme conditions, just to get the science." Conditions were, in fact, brutal. Fletcher said of the first station, "The T3 experiment has demonstrated that man can survive the killing cold and numbing winds of the desolate North Polar region, but only if he is supplied with the best of equipment." Holmquist describes the conditions. Violent storms, frequent fog, and persistent low overcast skies prevail in summer and winter. Winter temperatures are well below freezing and sometimes reach minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. In the summer, the temperature occasionally goes above freezing, but a chilling wind will drive the equivalent temperature to much lower values. Winter is a time of consistent darkness, except for a few hours of dim twilight near noon. In summer months, there's virtually constant daylight. You might imagine that summer is more popular than winter, but that isn't the case. In summer, the ice becomes too soft to land aircraft, and supplies are dropped by parachute. This can make for a difficult situation. Holmquist writes that in 1963, a scientist on another floating station had become ill, and the only option to retrieve him was called the aerotriever. The device consists of a specially designed seat attached to a 500-foot line carried into the air by a small balloon. An aircraft fitted with a special yoke then snags the line so that the aircraft crew can attach it to a winch. That all sounds quite harrowing, especially for an already ailing scientist, but the scientist died before the rescue could be attempted. The situation emphasized the difficulty of contact with the floating ice stations. Holmquist writes it was not until 7 years later that another death was to occur on an Arctic ice station under entirely different and unexpected circumstances. In the summer of 1970, the station was manned by 19 men. Holmquist writes that the 19 men were employees of federal agencies, civilian institutions, and private companies under contract to the ONR, as well as Alaskan natives employed by the Naval Atmospheric Research Laboratory as support personnel. The station manager, Benny P. Lightsley of Louisville, Kentucky, was employed by the U.S. Weather Bureau and was the technician in charge of its T3 meteorological program. As station manager, his position was largely titular. There was not much to do on the island, Holmquist writes. Recreational activities are quite limited and generally confined to books, games, and movies. One activity that had become almost routine was the brewing of wine from raisins or other fruits. The Anchorage Daily News writes, on July 16, 1970, Mario Escamilla accused fellow scientist Donald Leavitt of stealing his homemade raisin wine, certainly a prized possession. The argument grew heated, and Escamilla left to retrieve a rifle. On his way back, he was stopped by station manager Benny Lightsey. Holmquist writes that what happened at that point is not entirely clear, but it is evident that a heated discussion took place. A bear rifle, guns are kept in the camp for protection against polar bears, head by Escamilla, was fired in some way, and Lightsey received a chest wound near the heart. The killing raised many difficult questions. The station had no doctor, although that would have made little difference in this case. As Holmquist notes, from the information relayed, it was apparent that the victim had expired from a wound so serious that even immediate professional medical aid would have been to no avail. The remoteness of the site was demonstrated by the fact that the station radio operator was unable to contact NARL and ended up having to put a general SOS out by ham radio. Holmquist writes, ONR was now faced with a few dilemmas. An official investigation had to be made, and Lightsey's body and the suspect had to be returned to the States. Yet the runway at T3 was unusable for fixed-wing aircraft and will remain so until late September or October. But perhaps more thorny, the Anchorage Daily News writes, is who should investigate. The death raised a fascinating and heretofore largely unexamined issue of jurisdiction. Though primarily staffed by Americans, the ice island spent most of its existence in international waters. In fact, the island was frequently closer to Canada than the United States, which led to some diplomatic friction. No one was sure whether to treat the ice island like a territory, a ship, or something new. The Sault Ste. Marie, Canada Star wrote, Canada, in addition to claiming sovereignty over all the Arctic islands, has passed legislation asserting the right to jurisdictional control over water pollution up to 100 miles offshore in the Arctic. The case had significant implications, the paper reported. One specialist on the law of the sea was quoted as saying that the question is a can of worms we'd just as soon keep it closed. Holmquist noted that the laws of the sea are clear for jurisdiction over ships, boats, rafts, and debris, but ice islands were none of those. Beyond the international issue was the narrow issue of the Navy's responsibility. The project operated under the Navy's Office of Naval Research, but neither the deceased nor the suspect was a Navy employee. The task of informing and assisting the next of kin was taken by the Environmental Science Services Administration, the predecessor to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which oversaw the Weather Bureau. And who would investigate? The FBI had no assets in remote areas. Holmquist writes that the best option was the Navy's Naval Investigation Service, which was in the pre-Jethro Gibbs era before it was called NCIS. But the best idea for actual jurisdiction of civilians on the high sea was the Coast Guard, so a guardsman would have to accompany the NIS team. And how to get there? Without being able to land, the team would have to parachute, and removing the suspect would require the aerotriever. But the equipment would take weeks to prepare, and the suspect might not be cooperative. Waiting until planes could land in winter offered its own risks, as the suspect might still be dangerous. The idea to use helicopters also offered problems, as the ice island at the time was 600 miles from the nearest U.S. airfield at Thule, Greenland, and no Navy helicopters had enough range to get that far. The Air Force had helicopters at Thule, which could reach the island using refueling from their C-130 tankers, but that was a search and rescue team, and it required a declaration of an emergency to divert them from their regular mission. Even that scenario offered danger, as the weather was notoriously dangerous in the Arctic summer. As a further problem, the suspect would have to be taken directly to the United States, as stopping for refueling in Canada might create another issue of jurisdiction. To make matters worse, the incident was already showing up in the press. The ONR put the pieces together in just over a week, officially requesting aid from the Air Force and declaring an emergency to do so. A team including 2 NIS investigators, an assistant U.S. attorney, a Coast Guard yeoman, and a replacement for Lightsey arrived in Thule on July 24th. There, an Air Force helicopter had to be modified to add the probe for in-air refueling. The group departed Thule on the 27th and stayed 3 days on Fletcher's Island for the investigation. They departed with Escamilla and Lightsey's remains for Thule on the 29th. He stayed the night there, as Denmark had no interest in a crime that hadn't occurred on their territory, and departed on the 30th directly for Dulles International Airport, where Escamilla was charged by the Department of Justice with the crime of second-degree murder on the high seas. The U.S. claimed jurisdiction under special maritime law. In the end, the jurisdictional issue wasn't finally settled. Canada specifically waived jurisdiction in just this case without prejudice towards further claims about jurisdiction over T3. The U.S. amended the criminal code to give federal jurisdiction in cases where crimes are committed by or against U.S. citizens in places where another nation has jurisdiction, but that has not been tested internationally. At trial, the defense argued that the rifle was defective and might have gone off by accident. The jury found that Escamilla was not guilty of second-degree murder, but instead guilty of involuntary manslaughter. But even that conviction was overturned on appeal, and in a second trial, the jury acquitted him, so that after all the effort for the investigation and all the questions of jurisdiction, the jury finally decided that no crime had been committed. The station on Fletcher's Ice Island was finally abandoned in 1974. The island was last visited in 1979 and last seen from the air in July of 1983. Since then, it's presumed to have left the Arctic ice pack and melted in the Atlantic Ocean. My viewers are most likely familiar with the story of Robin Hood, and in most modern tellings of the story, King Richard I, the Lionheart, is a hero of the story who, upon returning from the Crusades, puts an end to the deprivations of his rapacious brother, John. Some even add the detail that Richard was being held for ransom, and John in various ways is trying to prevent the payment of that ransom in order to remain king. Like all legends, the story is a mix of some historical fact and an awful lot of fiction, but one thing is often left out of the story, that one of the reasons that Richard was being held for ransom had to do with the murder of another king. We don't know all that much about Conrad of Montferrat. We just know that his death came by murder most foul. It is a medieval murder mystery that deserves to be remembered. Jerusalem is an ancient city, with evidence of settlement at least as far back as 5,000 years. The fertile area at the crossroads of the Mediterranean has been held and conquered many times, and the walled city besieged by numerous empires. The city first came under Muslim rule after it was taken by the first caliphate from the Byzantines in 637 or 638. Reported threats to Christian pilgrims by the Seljuk Empire in the 11th century resulted in the First Crusade, a religious war initiated by Pope Urban II to retake the Holy Land. Jerusalem was taken by siege by the armies of the First Crusade from the Fatimid Caliphate in 1099, leading to the slaughter of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants and creating the Christian Kingdom of Jerusalem. A leader in the crusade, Godfrey of Boulogne, was made leader of the city, although he did not choose the title king. Godfrey died only a year later in 1100, by some accounts of sickness and by another of falling in battle. He died without an heir and was replaced by his brother Baldwin, who was the first leader of the kingdom to use the title king. Thereafter, the succession was decided by a group called the High Court of Jerusalem, a council of leading lords, although the council tended to favor blood relatives of the previous king. Thus, rulership was somewhat hereditary. Conflict with the Muslim world continued, although alliances often shifted and various crusader factions sometimes allied with different Muslim factions. The Crusader orders, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Knights Templar formed to defend the kingdom and protect pilgrims. With the aid of Europe, the kingdom grew, notably capturing the ancient city of Tyre in 1124. There was also internal conflict, as the kingdom still depended upon support from Europe and different factions vied for control. Baldwin I died without an heir and was replaced by his cousin, Baldwin II. Baldwin II died without a son and so left the throne to his daughter Melisende, who married a French count named Fulk, making him king. The imposition of a foreign king brought revolt among the native Crusader nobles. Moreover, Fulk was Count of Anjou, the grandfather of the future King Henry II of England, thus tying the kingdom to the Angevin dynasty. The kingdom faced a succession crisis during the reign of Baldwin IV, Fulk's grandchild, crowned in 1174. Baldwin suffered from leprosy, which, although not preventing him from ruling and fighting, did prevent him from marrying or having children. He spent much of his reign trying to groom an heir. Here the succession gets even more confusing. Baldwin IV had two half-sisters, Sibylla and Isabella. Sibylla, being the oldest, was made heir to the throne. She was wed to William of Montferrat. The Marquess of Montferrat were related to both the kings of France and the Holy Roman Empire. They had a son, also named Baldwin. But William died of a fever while Sibylla was still pregnant. At just 20 years old, the princess was the key to the throne, and machinations over who she would marry began immediately. The story is, unsurprisingly, convoluted. There was a quick move to force her marriage to a Jerusalem nobleman, Baldwin of Ibelin. As confusing as the number of Baldwins were, this was perceived as potential by Baldwin IV as an attempted coup, and Sibylla was quickly married to another nobleman who had recently arrived in the Holy Land, the relatively unknown Guy of Lusignan. However, the contemporary chronicle of Ernol suggests another simple possibility. Possibly the young Sibylla was simply seduced by Guy. Guy was of the House of Lusignan, which was in Poitou, part of the Angevin dynasty and vassals of the King of England, Henry II, and then his son Richard I. But Guy proved to be unpopular among both the barons of Jerusalem and the kings of the other Crusader states. Fearing a crisis, and with multiple claimants to the throne, the leper king held a council and settled upon his 6-year-old nephew, Baldwin, son of Sibylla and William. Baldwin was named Baldwin V and made co-ruler of Jerusalem. When Baldwin IV died in 1185, Baldwin V became king, and Count Raymond of Tripoli, another Crusader state, was made regent. This was significant. As historian Helena P. Schrader writes, the fact that Tripoli was made regent with the consent of the High Court, and the Count of Edessa was made the boy's guardian, are both indications of the intensity of the animosity and suspicion the bishops and barons of Jerusalem harbored for Guy of Lusignan by this time. But the young king suffered from ill health and died in 1186. Rumors of treachery were widespread, but Sibylla acted quickly and claimed the throne. Her husband was still unpopular, and the Jerusalem nobility only allowed her ascension if she annulled her marriage to Guy, a stipulation to which she agreed only if she was allowed to marry the man of her choice. She dutifully annulled her marriage, ascended the throne, and then chose to remarry Guy. The decision was so reviled that the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem refused to crown Guy. Sibylla chose to crown him herself. Despite opposition from virtually everyone but his apparently loyal wife and one important noble, Renaud of Chantillon, lord of the fiefdom of Haute-Jourdain, machinations had made Guy of Lusignan king of Jerusalem in 1186. It was a development that would drastically affect the kingdom. Under Baldwin IV and the regency of Raymond, an uneasy peace had been held with the Muslim caliphates, but Renaud chose to provoke war, first by attempting a disastrously failed attack on Mecca, and then by taking the sister of the great Seljuk Turk general Saladin prisoner. It isn't clear what Guy's role was in these decisions, but he was at least unable to rein Reynaud in. Less than a year later, Guy would lead the Crusader armies to a devastating defeat at the July 1187 Battle of Hattin. Again, historians disagree as to exactly how responsible Guy was for the defeat. While many, including Raymond of Tripoli, argued that he should seek peace and avoid confrontation, Guy sought battle, possibly because he was overconfident and headstrong, and possibly because he didn't trust Raymond. The Crusader army held a strong position at the village of Sepphoris, where they had an ample water supply. Yet Saladin managed to tempt Guy to lead his army on a chase, taking them away from their water supply. Some describe this tactic as a brilliant move by Saladin, others as a devastating tactical blunder by Guy, and yet others portray Guy as a victim of circumstance. He certainly had headstrong leaders, including Renaud, pushing him to attack. He also had been given a substantial sum by King Richard I of England, and perhaps felt that he had to secure victory. In any case, the Crusader army, exhausted by thirst and fighting on the ground of Saladin's choosing, was devastated. Historian Kelly de Vries wrote in 2007, "On 4 July 1187, the Crusades changed, and the change was felt not only in the Holy Land, but also throughout Syria, Egypt, Byzantium, and Europe. It seemed as if the Christian gods' wheel of fortune had fallen, while the Muslim gods had risen." Guy was captured, his army destroyed. He had left Jerusalem virtually defenseless, although a brief but futile stand was made under the leadership of one of his rivals, Balian of Ibelin. The kingdom was nearly overrun, but a new hero arose. Conrad of Montferrat, the younger brother of Sibylla's first husband William, was described by a member of the Byzantine court. Of beautiful appearance, comely in life's springtime, exceptional and peerless in manly courage and intelligence, and in the flower of his body's strength. In July of 1187, Conrad came to Jerusalem, apparently intending to join his father on crusade, only to find Jerusalem had fallen. His father was held prisoner, and the Crusader armies were in disarray. He sailed to the last stronghold of Jerusalem, the fortified city of Tyre, where the remnants of the Crusader army had gathered. A contemporary chronicle writes that he arrived in Tyre in time to prevent its commander from surrendering the city. He reorganized the defense and put up such a fight that a Muslim chronicler said of him, "He was a devil incarnate in his ability to govern and defend a town, and a man of extraordinary courage." Saladin went looking for easier prey, but returned for a second siege. There, the legend says, Saladin brought out Conrad's father and offered to release him if Conrad surrendered the city. Conrad reportedly said that he would not give one stone of Tyre's walls for his father's life, and saying that he had already lived a long life, pointed a crossbow at his father and threatened to kill him himself. It was a bold move. Saladin was shocked, but his buff called released the Marquess anyway. Tyre was saved. Meanwhile, the defeat at Hattin raised a furor throughout Europe, which called for another crusade. The Third Crusade was led by powerful kings, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England, although Frederick himself died on his way to the Holy Land. The Crusaders won some victories and reconquered a part of the kingdom, but not Jerusalem. And again, the kingdom needed a king. Saladin released Guy in 1188, and he came to Tyre, demanding that Conrad recognize him as king. Conrad refused, referring to the will of Baldwin IV that kings Henry II and Philip were to choose the next king. The method that Sibyl and Guy had used to claim the throne had come back to haunt them. Then Sibylla died of an illness in 1189, and Conrad and his supporters convinced her younger sister Isabella to divorce her husband and marry Conrad. It was an interesting machination. Conrad was possibly still married himself. He had taken another man's wife, and the marriage was technically illegal under church law since his brother had been married to Isabella's half-sister. Still, possibly because there was so much opposition to Guy, the papal legate sanctioned the marriage. This raised an issue. Richard supported Guy, as Lusignan was a vassal state of Richard. Philip, on the other hand, supported Conrad, his first cousin, once removed. In April 1192, the High Court of Jerusalem met. To Richard's dismay, they unanimously selected Conrad over Guy. Guy purchased the island of Cyprus and ruled there, continuing to use the title king. Then historian Patrick Williams of the University of Portsmouth wrote in a 1970 edition of the journal Traditio, Studies in Ancient and Medieval History, Thought and Religion, on 28 April 1192, Conrad, Marquess of Montferrat and Lord of Tyre, husband of the last royal princess of Jerusalem and newly elected king of that embattled state, was assassinated. Contemporary chronicles differ in some respects, but what is generally agreed is that Conrad was riding home from dinner with a light escort when two men approached, knocked him from his horse, and fatally wounded him with daggers. They attempted to escape, but one was killed and the other captured by Conrad's guards. Many accounts say that the men were part of the sect called the Order of Assassins, but at least one contemporary account said that the two men were servants of Conrad who had been bribed. Others said that they were servants but had taken the jobs with the purpose of the assassination. Williams writes, "It may be taken as established then that the murder of Conrad was accomplished on 28 April 1192 by two men who admitted to being of the sect of the Assassins, and who had therefore been sent to their task by Cinean, the master of the sect. Moreover, the culprits had successfully masqueraded as Christians and had been at least familiar with Conrad for some time, possibly even acting as his servants. Thus, the assassination was apparently planned well in advance. But the question remains, by whom?" Some accounts say the surviving men admitted that he had been hired by Richard. It's very plausible. Richard had opposed Conrad, and Conrad was in the process of negotiating with Saladin behind Richard's back. But Williams notes that the chronicle making that claim was written by a member of Saladin's court, and may have been covering for another prime suspect. Saladin, knowing his reputation and not wanting decisive leadership for the kingdom, may have had Conrad killed. But there were other suspects as well. Had Guy, having just lost to his rival, hired the assassins? Could it have been Humphrey of Tyrone, Isabella's former husband? Or had the leader of the assassins, Cinean, had his own reasons to kill Conrad? Williams discounts Humphrey, who had little to gain and was not known for his initiative, and Guy, who had apparently accepted his fate and made little protest to his loss. While Cinean had ordered the attack, his reason for doing so himself is questionable. A letter presented in 1193 suggests that Conrad had insulted Cinean when he captured a boat of assassins, but the letter was what Williams calls an obvious forgery. And if Cinean had reason to kill Conrad, why wait for years until he was elected king? Williams notes that Saladin also makes little sense, as he was in negotiation with Conrad and was known to be hostile to the Guild of Assassins and unlikely to use them. But there's also a case that Richard would not have used assassins, as it would have gone against his sense of honor, and he likely would have just simply challenged Conrad himself. Moreover, he was planning to return to England, and it's unlikely at that time that he was interested in upsetting the proverbial apple cart. William suggested another candidate, Henry II of Champagne. Henry was a French nobleman, a nephew of both Henry of France and Richard, who had come along with the Third Crusade. Henry had been sent by Richard to inform Conrad that he had been elected king. Williams writes, "On Tuesday, 28 April, Conrad was killed. By Thursday, Henry had arrived back in Tyre, been unanimously recognized as the person fit to succeed Conrad as king, and had been persuaded to marry Conrad's pregnant widow, Isabella." Williams argues that it is suspicious that Henry, who had left Tyre, found out about Conrad's assassination before Richard, almost as if he knew it was coming. Further suspicion comes because Henry paid a visit to the mountain stronghold of the Assassins in 1194. Was he there to pay a debt? Still, Williams concludes, it is admitted that the case against Henry is far from conclusive. It is, however, suggestive of at least as tenable as the case against any of the others. Richard continued the crusade, but failed to take Jerusalem. The continued existence of a reduced kingdom of Jerusalem was guaranteed by a 3-year truce in the 1192 Treaty of Jaffa, negotiated between Richard and Saladin. In a bizarre twist, Henry died, falling out of a window in 1197. The long-suffering Isabella married a fourth time, to Aymery of Lusignan, Guy's brother, who would replace Guy as Lord of Cyprus after his death in 1194. I know this is all rather confusing. There are too many people with the same names, enough machinations for a season of Game of Thrones, and a murder mystery with multiple suspects, none of whom are still around to be interrogated. Sometimes history is like that. It can be difficult to unravel, and sometimes mysteries remain a mystery, even more than 800 years later. And what do we really know about Conrad? In fiction and film, he's often been portrayed as something of a villain, but Mariana Gilchrist of Hull University notes that the historical description of Conrad has been tainted by Anglo-Angevin chronicle and romance traditions that are favorable to Richard I. Is it possible that instead of being a villain, that he was actually a very capable ruler? Had he survived, how might have impacted his kingdom? And one further important thing to note, when Richard was returning home to England, he had to travel in disguise because he had created enmity with both the French and the Holy Roman Empire. When he was finally discovered and held, it was by Leopold V, the Duke of Austria, who happened to be Conrad of Montferrat's first cousin. One of the charges made against Richard at the time was that he had arranged for the murder of Conrad. Guilty or not, Richard took the blame, and England paid the price. Little remembered today is Manhattan's Knickerbocker Athletic Club, which once sat on the corner of Madison Avenue and 45th Street. It was once one of the most exclusive and most successful athletic clubs in the nation. But in 1898, into that aristocratic environment came a story of intrigue, of a love triangle, of patent medicines, and of a trial of the century for murder most foul. It is history that deserves to be remembered. On November 22nd, 1877, the New York Times reported that the Knickerbocker Athletic Club would be holding its inaugural meeting on December 3rd and 4th. Open to all amateurs would be a 75-yard run, a 1-mile walk, running broad jump, quarter-mile run, running high jump, 3-mile walk, putting the shot, 1-mile run, 120 yards hurdle race, and half-mile run. The prizes, the Times reported, will be a gold medal to the winner of each event and a silver to the second. The blog Daytonian in Manhattan by Tom Miller explained in 2015, a membership in one or more of the exclusive men's clubs was a social necessity for wealthy gentlemen in the decades preceding the outbreak of the Civil War. As the century progressed, other clubs that were not purely social were founded. University clubs, professional clubs, and sporting clubs, for instance. Among the latter was the Manhattan Athletic Club, an organization for sporty sons of millionaires who pursued a broad array of activities, from robust sports like swimming, boxing, and track and field events, to the less physically taxing billiards and pool. The club was organized in November 1877. Miller writes that for several years the club maintained an exclusive membership of just 33, with members paying a substantial rent of $9,000 a year, the equivalent of around $390,000 today. But, Miller writes, the club slowly expanded its membership, requiring the construction of a new building. The New York Times reported on August 3, 1888, that the club had purchased the property of the Gospel Tabernacle Church on the southeast corner of Madison Avenue and 45th Street for $160,000. The Times reported that a magnificent clubhouse would be built on the site that would be a substantial 5-story brick structure with stone trimmings. In keeping with the exclusive tone, the project, including the acquisition of the property and the demolition of the old building, would be the princely sum of $500,000. The club was spectacular, maybe ostentatious. The sports magazine Outing wrote in July 1891 that the palatial structures will ages hence mark the taste and skill of the artist and the artisan of New York in the last decade of the 19th century. In 1895, the club scored a coup, hiring Harry Cornish, formerly athletic director of the Chicago Athletic Association. A man of whom the Times wrote, as a member and promoter of athletics, Mr. Cornish is without peer. The Times bragged that so long as Cornish is to be the athletic manager, it is pretty certain that the club will be heard from in track and field sports in 1896. The club was at its height, at a time when the Times would later report its membership included champion performers in many branches of sport. Those included Fred Westing, who had held the world record in the 100-yard dash, and Al F. Copeland, who had won the U.S. Outdoor National Championship in the 200-yard hurdle race 3 years in a row. Team members wore as their symbol the cherry diamond, an emblem that, the Times wrote, has been known and respected not only in America, but in almost every country in Europe. The Manhattan Athletic Club, colloquially called the Knickerbocker Athletic Club, was expensive, exclusive, successful, and about to become embroiled in scandal. The Hartford Courant reported on December 29, 1898. On the morning of December 24th, there came to the desk of the Knickerbocker Athletic Club office, by mail, a package wrapped in manila paper and sealed with wax. On the flat surface was written in a feminine hand, disguised to cause the impression that writing was done by a man, the address, Mr. Harry Cornish, Knickerbocker Club, Madison Avenue and 45th Street, New York City. In the wrapper of manila paper was a pasteboard box marked Tiffany. In the box was the usual cotton packaging, and in the center, wrapped in white tissue paper, was a vial holder of polished silver. The paper described the vial holder as a pretty medicine stand with silver mountings bearing the stamp of Tiffany and Company. The stand had evidently cost considerable. The stand also included a bill of medicine. The Courant writes that in the receiving cylinder was a 10-cent bottle of bromo seltzer. The vial would have been familiar. John Odell wrote in the Redex Report, a publication highlighting digital historical collections, that Isaac E. Emerson, the man who patented the formula for bromo seltzer, was as well known in the late 19th century as Bill Gates is today. Bromo seltzer was billed as a cure for exhaustion, headache, insomnia, brain fatigue, loss of appetite, and other common complaints, sold in distinctive little blue bottles. Cornish was, the Courant writes, amused at his present. On the night of December 28th, Mr. Cornish attended the theater with his aunt, Mrs. Kate J. Adams, described as a wealthy widow living in the city, and her married daughter, Mrs. Florence Rogers. Cornish lived with Adams on the third floor of an apartment house at the corner of Columbus Avenue and 86th Street, along with Rogers, her husband, and her mother-in-law. The three had supper together afterwards, and Cornish accompanied the ladies home. Cornish, the paper reported, had taken along the present that he had received to Mrs. Adams' flat to show her and her daughter. When at breakfast, Mrs. Adams and her daughter complained of a headache, Cornish thought of the bottle of bromo seltzer that had come with his gift. Mrs. Adams, the current writes, took a dose of it in water. She was instantly seized with convulsions and died within half an hour. Cornish had swallowed some of the contents at the same time as Mrs. Adams had taken the fatal draught. He was taken violently ill, but the doctor saved him after hard work. The paper reported a first-hand account. Laughingly, Mrs. Adams took the mixture and gave off an odor of almonds, but this was not noticed. Cornish also took some of the mixture. Suddenly, all were attracted by the screams of Mrs. Adams calling for her daughter. Mrs. Rogers rushed into the bathroom and found her mother writhing in pain on the floor, gasping for breath. Cornish himself grew ill. Cornish sent the hall boy of the apartment house for a doctor, who, the Boston Globe wrote, arrived just in time to see Mrs. Adams die. But the Current writes that the doctor gave a powerful antidote to Cornish. Ominously, the Current writes, Dr. Hitchcock tasted the poison, which was evidently cyanide of potassium. The theory that the police are working on, the Current wrote, is that the murder was intended, but that the intended victim was Harry Cornish. The paper wrote that police are attempting to discover where the vial came from. The Globe reported on the 30th that the little silver gewgaw was manufactured in Newark, New Jersey, and police were tracking its sale. The paper suggested that an arrest was imminent. The Birmingham, Alabama Age Herald reported on March 15th that the police and the entire detective force were called in and immediately began to work on the case. Cornish was closely questioned as to who could have any personal grudge against him. Suspicion was centered upon Roland B. Molyneux, a young chemist living in Brooklyn. The Press Association noted that Molyneux was a chemist and is the superintendent of a paint or color factory in Newark, where the vial holder was sold. In the manufacture of these colors at the factory, cyanide of mercury is used. This finding then created a new suspicion. The Age Herald continues. About this time, attention was called to the suspicious death of H.C. Barnett, a member of the Knickerbocker Athletic Club who had died there the previous October. It was supposed that the death was caused from an overdose of cut-now powders, which he was in the habit of taking. The suspicion led to the exhuming of the body of Barnett, removing the stomach and having it chemically tested. It found also that traces of cyanide of mercury were evidence in the organs. The Brooklyn Standard Union described Barnett as a prosperous businessman. Historian Harold Schechter described him in his 2007 book, The Devil's Gentleman, as a 32-year-old bon vivant named Henry Crossman Barnett. Brown-haired, blue-eyed, with a small, neatly trimmed mustache and a decided paunch. He had joined the club, as one commentator put it, with a pleasant hope of reducing his weight. The Globe writes that Henry C. Barnett, who lived at the club and was in business at 19 Broad Street, received a package of arsenic on November 1st, part of which he took, believing it was a harmless powder known as cut-now powder. He died 12 days later. This poison, as in Mr. Cornish's case, was received by mail at the Knickerbocker Athletic Club. Aside from having the requisite skills as a chemist, Molyneux, the son of a famous Civil War Union general of volunteers, faced suspicion because he had motive against both Cornish and Barnett. Molyneux was an athlete. An 1890 edition of the Wilkes-Barre Sunday Leader described him as the king of the horizontal bar. But as a member of the Knickerbocker Athletic Club, he had clashed with Cornish over how Cornish ran the club. After several encounters, Molyneux had gone to the board seeking to have Cornish fired. When the board stood behind Cornish, he quit the club and joined another. While newspapers described Cornish as having had a falling out with Barnett, it is clear that both courted the same woman. The Press Association reported in April that Barnett had been quite devoted to a very attractive young woman named Blanche Cheesebro. The New York World reported that it had been rumored about the clubhouse that Mr. Barnett had asked Miss Cheesebro to become his wife and that a date for the wedding had been fixed. But when Barnett died, Cheesebro became engaged to Molyneux. The Press Association writes that only 19 days after Barnett's death, she married Roland Molyneux. But it was testimony in the February coroner's inquest that made the case against Molyneux. A clerk at a business that rented private mailboxes identified Molyneux as having rented a box in Barnett's name. The Baltimore Sun wrote it was proved some time ago that bottles of medicine had been sent to that box. The Sun writes that handwriting experts were called, and one after another they declared that the hand that wrote the address on the poison package and forged the names of Harry Cornish and H.C. Barnett to letters sent to drug firms ordering medicines was the hand of Roland Molyneux. The coroner's jury concluded, we find that Catherine J. Adams came to her death on December 28, 1898, by poison by cyanide, administered by Harry S. Cornish, to whom said poison had been sent in a bottle of bromo seltzer by Roland B. Molyneux. Molyneux was arrested. The trials that followed were sensations, one of the so-called trials of the century. The case was taken before a grand jury in February, but the jury failed to indict and Molyneux was released. The New York World reported that Molyneux was actually discharged in court, only to be rearrested the very second he reached the corridor of the courthouse. Taken before a second grand jury, Molyneux was indicted for the murder of Mrs. Adams. The trial came in November, lasted more than 13 weeks. The World wrote that Cornish told his story. He was on the witness stand for 4 days. His cross-examination was probably one of the most bitter ever listened to. Convinced that the case had failed, Molyneux's attorney did not put up a defense. The World writes, after consulting about 12 hours on February 10, 1900, the juries filed into court. Guilty of murder in the first degree, announced the foreman. 6 days later, he was sentenced to death in the electric chair. But this convoluted case would not end so easily. After 20 months on death row in Sing Sing, Molyneux's conviction was overturned on appeal. The issue was that the trial had allowed evidence suggesting that Molyneux had murdered Barnett, even though he had only been charged with the murder of Adams. Justice William Werner of the appellate court wrote that the state cannot prove against the defendant any crime not alleged in the indictment. The principle is that the state generally cannot use a previous crime to imply a defendant's guilt. That rule is still today called the Molyneux Rule and is considered a landmark case regarding the admissibility of evidence in the state of New York. In the second trial, guilt largely turned on testimony regarding handwriting. In November of 1902, after nearly 4 years in prison on death row, Roland Molyneux was acquitted by the jury after just 13 minutes of deliberation. Of course, there's still disagreement over the conduct of the trials and over Molyneux's guilt, and the burning question, if Molyneux didn't do it, then who did, has never been adequately answered. And if you think that Molyneux got away with it, well, it cost him dearly. Not only did he spend years in prison, but his father nearly bankrupted himself paying for his defense, and his wife, Blanche, over whom he had allegedly committed murder, divorced him almost immediately after his acquittal and married her divorce attorney. He had become a playwright while in prison and had been married again, this time to his playwright broker, just before his play about prison called The Man Inside was to be performed. But he had become increasingly unpredictable over time, perhaps stressed by the death of his mother, but also perhaps under the weight of his time in prison and the constant suspicion of guilt, and some argue possibly suffering from syphilis. He had a violent break, and in 1913, just 10 days after his new wedding, was committed to an insane asylum. He died there in 1917. New York Times reporter William Grimes wrote in 2007 that poetic justice was served. Might have been a new century, but Nemesis operated by the old Victorian rules. And in a strange irony, the original active ingredients in bromo seltzer, bromide, and acetanilide were both found to be poisonous, resulted in many deaths. So maybe the cyanide wasn't even necessary. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.